Now, you may not be aware, but currently in Paris, they're undergoing climate talks. Interesting. Now, how do people feel about these climate talks? Well, I want to get into that. So, according to a recent poll, a solid majority of Americans say the U.S. should join an international treaty to limit the impact of global warming. Now, this isn't the only question that was asked. There's actually a lot of questions on this New York Times CBS News poll that I'm going to go over. Now, according to this poll, 2/3 of Americans support the U.S. joining a binding international agreement to curb growth of greenhouse gas emissions. However, a slim majority of Republicans remain opposed. Now, the poll also found that 63% of Americans said that they would support domestic policy limiting carbon emissions from power plants. And that also includes a majority, a very slim majority, but a majority of Republicans. Republican voters are out there saying, hey man, let's do something about climate change. This is getting to be a problem. Not only does it exist, we should actually have domestic policies to limit carbon emissions from power plants. That's pretty positive. Now, this might actually help negotiators at this climate change summit going on in Paris right now. It'll definitely help negotiators, but something that should be worried about, that you should be concerned about, is the partisan divide in Congress. Now, the people have spoken on this. There are majorities, slim on the Republican side, but a majority of both parties that want us to do something about climate change, that want us to act. Now, that doesn't necessarily represent what's going on in Congress. Congress is a completely different animal, because what we have in Congress are people like James Inhofe, senator from Oklahoma, who brought in a snowball. Remember, brought in a snowball, threw it on the floor and said, well, climate change? What name so? I've got a snowball that proves you wrong. We still have people like that in Congress. So obviously that's going to be a big, big obstacle. But nonetheless, maybe the support of people might actually help to push people push our people in Congress towards actually adopting a resolution, whether it be binding or non-binding. Now, most of Americans support a binding resolution, but that doesn't mean that we have to go in that direction. Anyway, let's get back to the polls. Now, 75% of Americans polled said that climate change, global warming, was already having a serious environmental impact or would in the future. 9 in 10 Democrats and 58% of Republicans. That's still a majority. It's not as good as we would like. But nonetheless, it's a majority. We'll take it. Now, 1/3 of Republicans said that they believed it would never have much of an impact on the environment. So there's your negative on that one. Now, when it comes to policy, most Americans agree something is going on, and that it's a problem. So what about policy? Well, they get into specifics in this CBS New York Times poll. Now, Americans generally actually favor regulating business activity. Well, look at that. Yes, let's regulate business. They would rather regulate corporations and how much emissions they put out than going after the consumers. And actually, the poll found that whenever you do something like increasing an electricity tax, for example, or a gas tax, people are generally opposed. But when it comes to taxing corporations, which I think is the right way to go, people are more in favor. Now, there's a couple different reasons for that, a lot of which I agree with. So let's get to the numbers, as I had mentioned. Now, the poll found broad support for capping power plant emissions. Logging and drilling and mining on public lands. Half of all Americans said they thought the government should take steps to restrict drilling, logging, and mining on public lands. compared to with 45% who opposed such restrictions. Now, support for limiting mineral extraction on public lands rose to 58% among Democrats. But just 1 in 5 Americans favored increasing taxes on electricity as a way to fight global warming. 6 in 10 were strongly opposed, including 49% of Democrats. And support was not much higher for increasing gasoline taxes, 36% overall. Well, that's because it impacts consumers. It impacts the people, especially poor people. It's what we call a regressive tax. When you impact the lowest on the totem pole when it comes to income, well, you're going to hurt them more. Well, if you go up to the corporations, for example, the oil companies that have made so much money off being able to pollute and off the oil glut that we had, they made billions and billions of dollars. Now, they're not making as much now since gas prices are actually cheaper, but they had a pretty damn good run. ExxonMobil is one of the richest corporations ever that mankind has ever had on this planet. If you tax them and cap their emissions, well, that would be a positive. And that shouldn't hurt consumers. Now, a lot of people say, well, they'll just pass that on to the consumers. Well, that would be unfortunate. And maybe that would be a better reason to invest in solar instead. Now, on Monday, I had mentioned that the UN began a climate change conference in Paris. Now, I want to get into some details about that. Now, according to this, representatives from 195 countries in the European Union got together in an effort to reach a binding agreement. This is the 21st gathering of nations who belong to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, this is actually the first gathering. This is really important because it's the first gathering since Copenhagen that actually has high hopes for actually putting a global commitment into place. Every country is going to make their own pledge to how much they're going to try and reduce their carbon emissions, which is a good thing. Now, President Obama had said, quote, "We have to do something about climate change because it's not only going to have an impact on our children and our grandchildren, and we have a moral obligation to leave them a planet that is as wonderful as the one we inherited from our forebears, but it's also really important to America's bottom line and economic growth." So that's very important to do something about it. Now, younger people, well, we agree with this message, and we're much more receptive to it. 51% of respondents said that they're worried about global warming a great deal or a fair amount, and that's among adults under 30. That number was 54%. And among young people under 30 that are also Democrats, that went to about 60%. And while 68% of respondents under 30 supported taxing companies' carbon emissions, that was just 5 points higher than the overall number and lower than nearly 3/4 of Democrats who professed support. Now, most respondents to the recent poll also said that in situations where a sacrifice must be made, protecting the environment is now more important than stimulating the economy. And that's by a margin of 54% to 34%. This was actually identical to the numbers pre-recession. Now, of course, when a recession hit, the primary focus of people was the economy. We got to get the economy going. We got to do something about the economy. We got to do something. People are hurting. No, people are still hurting, right? However, people aren't worried as much about the economy now as they were. They're actually worrying about the environment, and that's actually a really good thing. So, there you go. This is kind of optimistic. When you look at all the data in this poll, it's very optimistic that something will come from these climate talks. Now, I'm a little cynical because I see the politics and I see Congress and I see Jim Inhofe with the snowball. But if there can be enough public pressure to actually do something about climate change, well, maybe, as I said, maybe that will push our politicians towards actually doing something about it.